War in the Gulf. To eject Iraq from Kuwait, Western and Arab allies fielded the biggest army since Korea. They used the latest high-technology weapons guided by lasers and computers with pinpoint accuracy. The biggest air offensive since World War II. 100,000 sorties mounted to neutralize the Iraqi war machine. Deception, speed, and power were the key to the 100-hour land battle. Using the most modern artillery ever. Nearly 200,000 Iraqi troops gave themselves up. Perhaps 100,000 died, against 150 Allied troops killed in Desert Storm and Desert Sabre. Of the present Gulf nations, Kuwait existed as long ago as 1757. What's now Iraq was then only 3 provinces of the Turkish Ottoman Empire south of Kurdistan. All opposed Turkish rule, and Lawrence of Arabia won many to the British side against the Turks in the First World War. Sheikh Faisal, in return, was promised an independent kingdom, the artificial country of Iraq, handed over in 1932. 1961, British forces land in newly independent Kuwait. Within weeks of that independence, Britain had been forced to send paratroopers and an armored brigade to protect the tiny kingdom against a threatened Iraqi invasion. On this occasion, the rapid build-up preempted Iraqi action, but it also reinforced Iraq's belief that Western protection was merely to keep oil prices down. 30 years later, Iraq's costly adventure against Iran meant she needed higher revenues to revive her wrecked economy. So another attempt to absorb Kuwait began. Iraqi forces moved in after Saddam Hussein lost his temper over Kuwaiti refusal to agree higher oil prices to pay for his disastrous war with Iran. Unprepared for the sudden order, his forces reached Kuwait City soon after dawn, meeting fierce Kuwaiti resistance. But most of Iraq's 200 tanks supporting the invasion had too little ammunition to withstand a counterattack. An immediate Allied intervention might well have ended Saddam's latest adventure then and there. Instead, the military build-up only began 5 days later, as the West opted for diplomacy through the United Nations, which initially voted for sanctions against Iraq. Underestimating the strength of the new superpower détente was Saddam's first mistake. His traditional Soviet aid was no longer forthcoming. And Arab opinion united as never before. Even those traditionally less than friendly to the West, like Syria, condemned Iraq, and backed that condemnation by sending troops to join the Allied forces. Only Jordan and the Palestinians appeared to back Saddam. That coalition made it possible for the Saudi King Fahd to invite American-led forces to mass in Muslim Saudi Arabia, eventually to free Kuwait. At sea, Allied warships hunted sanctions busters. Iraq had only one major export, oil, making it particularly vulnerable to embargo. Allied ships intercepted nearly 8,000 vessels, arresting 46.
What is your cargo, please? What was your last port in the Gulf, please?
Last port in Gulf is in Fujairah.
Thank you very much. Goodbye. Have a safe trip.
By September, events had taken a more sinister turn. Hundreds of Westerners had been rounded up in Kuwait, then brought to Baghdad to join foreign workers already detained there. They were hostages. Saddam called them human shields, there to deter Allied attacks on Iraqi targets. The captives were paraded on Iraqi television, but scenes involving British children merely angered Western allies. Unexpectedly, the unpredictable Saddam, scorned for hiding behind women's skirts by Margaret Thatcher, freed the hostages. The PLO leader, Yasser Arafat, anxious for credit in post-war negotiations, had persuaded Saddam that hostage-taking was counterproductive. Perhaps more importantly, Western moves to go one last mile for peace had convinced Saddam of American weakness and unwillingness to go to war, so human shield hostages would be unnecessary. Saddam had again miscalculated, and the countdown to war had already begun, with the United Nations setting a January deadline for Iraqi withdrawal from Kuwait. At the end of the military build-up, Allied forces in the Gulf totaled 750,000 people, 3,500 tanks and nearly 2,000 combat planes. With two-thirds of them American, there was little doubt who would run the show. Saddam Hussein took personal command of Iraqi forces, having learnt little from his blunders in the war with Iran, which left him with the world's fourth biggest army, but shattered his economy. Needing higher oil revenues to recover, he claimed part of Kuwait's oil wealth, invaded when he lost his temper with their refusal to give in, and misjudged American resolve to eject him. Coalition forces were led by Norman Schwarzkopf, a blunt-talking, dirty boots warrior nicknamed Storming Norman or Bear. A veteran of Vietnam and Grenada, he did learn from American mistakes. Operation Desert Storm, his plan, covered more pages than the Manhattan telephone book and used football tactics as well as classic military ones to outflank the Iraqis. War began with a massive air offensive, 116,000 sorties aimed at Iraq's many airfields, the launching zones for its Scud surface-to-surface missiles, its chemical, biological and nuclear installations, ammunition dumps, communications and Republican Guard bases. The sinister stealth bombers spearheaded the raids, a plane never seen in public before. Part of its role was the pinpoint bombing of important Iraqi establishments vital to Saddam Hussein's war effort. Establishments often close to populated areas where accuracy was vital to avoid civilian deaths. One particular target was this building, Iraqi Air Force headquarters in Baghdad. One of many missions flown in the teeth of opposition from Iraq's anti-aircraft batteries, a video camera on the attacking plane recorded a direct hit. Despite the technology, the missions were still hair-raising for the air crews.
I watched some very young men become middle-aged and somewhat more mature that particular night, and I've seen the same thing in the subsequent nights.
That sentiment was repeated many times as the realities of combat were faced. For Arabs on the coalition side, especially Saudis and Kuwaitis away from their homes, Allied air successes came as the first really good news of the crisis. A crucial part in the air offensive was played by the RAF Tornadoes, 45 of them out of a total UK air fleet of 75. They had one of the most dangerous tasks, low-level bombing of enemy airfields to neutralize the Iraqi Air Force, which included some of the most up-to-date Soviet fighters. Like the Americans, being in action brought a camaraderie impossible to imagine in peacetime.
Hi, Mom. We're back.
Yeah, well, as I say, it ran on rails. It was well planned. You know, we achieved, well, we're going to have to wait and see what we achieved, but, you know, from what we saw, looked good.
We're going to go straight into a debrief, so we're a little rushed at the moment. We're all back.
The ground crews, as in past wars, worked like fury too, keeping the planes up to scratch. The Tornadoes carried the JP-233 runway denial bomb to tear huge holes in airfields and scatter anti-personnel devices to deter anyone trying to clear up. Outgoing aircrew drew pistols to help defend themselves if they ended up in enemy territory. A number were taken prisoner after being shot down and were tortured for information about Allied air strategy. The RAF's particular campaign helped to persuade Iraq to withdraw many of its combat aircraft from the unequal struggle. Over 120 planes went to Iran and stayed there. The Tornadoes continued to fly to attack a wide variety of targets. Much of the bombing was at night. The outskirts of Baghdad were hit over and over. For the residents of this and other Iraqi centers, the air raids became a terrifying nightly ordeal, even though the international coalition continued to pronounce it was military targets that were being taken out. For the exhausted crews, the relief that almost all of them made it safe home every time was intense.
Bombs on target. So hopefully we've done some damage all to the war effort.
And other good news, if it is good news.
Absolutely cracking, absolutely cracking. It's cheered the guys that are here up very much so. So yeah, it's all good stuff.
It's marvellous. We're all took off, we all got back.
At Dhahran, Bahrain and other bases, most of the daylight hours were taken up with getting the planes ready for more sorties. Ground crews tirelessly checking them over, ensuring the Iraqis rather than technical hitches were the enemy. Low-level flying, the Tornado's speciality, required supreme skills and the closest cooperation between individual pilots.
4 miles.
Keep on going.
Okay. Happy with that. We've got a rolling looking for the left. Chapping with that. Happy with that. Stand by.
Keep on going.
Stand by.
Okay,
2 miles.
check.
Keep on going. Okay.
Charlie.
Looking good. 2.4 miles. Okay, nothing on the RHWR.
Taking out airfields had required its own special training. The results, though, were spectacular.
On the RHWR. Okay.
Over readiness.
Okay, committing. There we go. It's going. It's going. Did not keep running. There's the canisters.
The phrase pinpoint accuracy was constantly heard, but all the evidence, even post-war, was that it was almost always achieved, cutting supply routes like bridges as well as blasting airfields and installations. Military spokesmen described how the operations were executed.
Going into the targets, this one happened to be relatively lightly defended. We had a number of bombers on the raid, obviously. They hit the target and hit it on time, as we're supposed to, and dropped the bombs as accurately as we were able. The nature of the target was such that it burned